Welcome to the Adult Bible Study of the First Baptist Church over at City. My name is Charles. I'm one of our associate pastors, and it is an absolute pleasure to be able to dive in with you again today to the book of Isaiah. We're in Isaiah chapter 40, verses 18 through 31, and I hope you enjoy today's Bible study.
Isaiah 40, verse 18. With whom will you compare God? What likeness will you set up for comparison with him? Our context for today's verses is found in chapter 40 through chapter 48. And in this chapter, God is bringing comfort to the people that he has said, and Isaiah has prophesied in chapter 39, that they would be exiled into the people of Babylon, and that the people of Babylon would have conquest over them. So this happens in chapter 39, and then we have chapter 40 through 48, where God is bringing comfort to his people. And it's highlighted by this very first verse, Isaiah 40, verse 1, comfort. Comfort my people, says your God. This is how Isaiah starts this entire section. And then he goes on in verses 3 through 5 to prophesy about the coming of the Lord, proclaimed by a voice of one crying out, prepare the way of the Lord. Most of you who are listening probably have a reference for that, and that is technically the prophecy about John the Baptist, who is in the wilderness crying out, make straight the highway for our God in the desert. And then it proclaims the glory of God coming down and leveling out the valleys and the mountains and the hills, making the uneven ground smooth and the rough places plain, because the glory of the Lord will appear, and all humanity together will see it, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. This is what John the Baptist prophesies about Jesus the Messiah who comes, and this is how Isaiah prophesies about Jesus coming. And so we have this comfort section which is cast in the light of this messianic prophecy of Jesus coming, leveling out the rough places, and appearing in the glory of God. And then Isaiah comes to this point in Isaiah 18 where he's asking these rhetorical questions. With whom will you compare God? And what likeness will you set up for comparison with him? These are two rhetorical questions, and they're meant to point specifically at something for Isaiah's readers. And with both of these questions, with whom will you compare God? Well, the obvious answer is no one. And in what likeness will you set up for comparison with him? Well, that would be none. Nothing can compare to God. No one can compare to God. This first question, the combination of these two questions asks that outlandish question. Who is equal to God? And the answer is absolutely none. But the prophecy goes on. Isaiah 40, 19 through 20. An idol? Something that a smelter casts and a metal worker plates with gold and makes silver chains for? A poor person contributes wood for a pedestal that will not rot. He looks for a skilled craftsman to set up an idol that will not fall over. Isaiah continues the prophecy by asking the outlandish question, can you compare God to an idol? Can you cast something in the likeness of God, an idol? This is an outlandish question because of the second commandment. Exodus 24 through 6 tells us this. It says, do not make an idol for yourself, whether in shape of anything in the heavens above, or the earth, or in the water under the earth, and do not bow in worship to them. Do not serve them. Why is that? I, the Lord, am a jealous God, bringing consequences of the father's iniquity on the children to the third and fourth generations, but showing faithful love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commands. The blessings for following God far outweigh the consequences for not, and specifically with idol worship. We are not to bow down to anything in the heavens above or the earth below or the waters under the earth. There's nothing in the created order that we are to bow down to, because there's one God, the Lord, your God, and he is a jealous God. He deserves the right to be worshipped as the only one true God, and thus should be worshipped as the only one true God. Because idols are really only things that are cast by smelters, which the word smelters here is specifically a metal worker or a craftsman, and they're known for creating cast molds or metal molds of something, pouring the molten metal into those molds, and then the molds are then formed into whatever they're trying to make, which is why the word cast is used. That's what it means for a smelter to cast something. And then once they've been made and fashioned, then metal workers plate them with gold to make them beautiful. And they also hang silver chains on them, again, to make them beautiful. But what are they? They're nothing but materials that are made by human hands, by metal workers, smelters, and a poor person contributes the wood for the pedestal. This word pedestal here, it's interesting that they translate it this way, because the English translations differ on whether the wood is for a pedestal or for the specific offering. And the Hebrew is just, it's vague in this, but the point that is being made is that it's made by human hands, because it's just a block of wood. And they take it to a craftsman who sets it up, an idol that will not fall over. For an idol to fall over is a bad thing, and it shows weakness within that deity or within that God. So it's important that they don't fall over. And the main point is how ridiculous it is to worship something that's made by human hands rather than the one true living God. But then Isaiah turns back to the people and starts asking them these rhetorical questions. Do you not know? Have you not heard? Has it not been declared to you from the beginning? Have you not considered the foundations of the earth? These are 4 rhetorical questions in escalating fashion, intended to convince all the listeners of the greatness of God. Do you not know? This is, remember, written to the people of Israel, for them to admit that they knew or should know who the Creator God is. Have they not heard? Well, of course the people of Israel would have heard. They have priests and prophets and leaders who are supposed to teach them the truths of God. Not only that, but they were given the words of God, and so they should have heard. Has not it been declared to you from the beginning? Well, again, they've had the words of God, and ever since Moses wrote them down, and from the very beginning, from Adam moving forward, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, they've heard of the glories of God and what God can do. And then have you not considered the foundations of the earth? Again, this is cast very, very similar to the last questions from the beginning. From the beginning of creation, the foundations of the earth, where it was created. Our understanding of God goes all the way back to creation. And it can be seen in creation. As Psalm 19:1 says, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the expanse, or the heavens, or the sky, proclaims the work of his hands. Creation itself proclaims who God is if we will just open our eyes to see it. Now, from these questions, Isaiah then turns to a proclamation of the glory of God. God is enthroned above the circle of the earth. Literally, God sits or dwells or remains sitting. Those are the words that enthroned means, above the circle of the earth. If we look up at the sky and look around, we can spin around an entire circle and see the horizon in specific locations. And it appears to be in a circle, and so most likely the circle of the earth is just from the perspective of Isaiah at this time period, a few thousand years ago. The point that he's making is that God is enthroned above this. God is enthroned above the earth, and thus he is oriented in a sovereign rule over the earth, so that the inhabitants are like grasshoppers. A grasshopper is an insignificant, small insect. And so the inhabitants, this is all rulers, all people, the people of the earth look small to God. And his power extends vastly because he stretches out the heavens like thin cloth and spreads them out like a tent to live in. If we look at the sky is like a dome that goes over top of the world. It's like God has stretched it out as a tent. This depicts God's skill in creating and sustaining the universe. And he reduces princes to nothing. This goes back to the grasshopper comment just a second ago, that princes, even those of high human authority, nothing compared to God. And those judges, those people who rule on the earth, in comparison to God, they're like a wasteland. They're barely planted, they're barely sown, their stems hardly root in the ground when he blows them away. And they wither, and a whirlwind carries them like stubble. People live only a short time in comparison to the vast eternity of God who sits enthroned above the earth. Not only does he look down on us and he sees us like grasshoppers in a field, small, very powerless in comparison, but we're also powerless as far as time. As soon as it appears like we've been planted and we have authority that lasts, we don't, because our bodies give out. Old age takes over. The youthful exuberance that we once had is gone, and we've barely even taken root. And now we're withering and we're carried away. This all shows the sovereign power of God for who he is. Daniel 2:19 tells us in a very similar way that Daniel praised God of the heaven and declared, "May the name of God be praised forever and ever, for wisdom and power belong to him." That is, the power and wisdom, strength and knowledge, they belong to God. He changes times and seasons. He controls the seasons, and he removes kings and establishes kings. In the same way that this passage that we're in right now talks about how princes and rulers come to nothing, judges are like a wasteland, they barely planted and they're sown, and then he blows them away. In the same way, God establishes rulers. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He is the God who is in control, and that's exactly what Isaiah is trying to tell us here. And then God has a question for the people. To whom will you compare me? Who is my equal? God is specifically challenging his people to acknowledge his incomparability and his utter uniqueness. There's none like God. It's exactly what even the phrase that Isaiah uses to proclaim his name, the Holy One, that is the set apart one or the separated one. He's utterly unique in every way. And he tells the people, look up and see. Most translations say this in a way that points the people to look up to heaven. Look up to the heavens or look on high and see. Who created these being the stars? He brings out the stars by number. He calls all of them by name. Because of his great power and strength, not one of them is missing. God has three activities that he does over the stars. One, he leads them out as if he were commander-in-chief of the royal army of the stars. He leads them out in military language right here in this section of the verse, pointing to how he brings them out by their number, by their rank. And he stations them where they're supposed to be. Not only does he do this, but he calls all the stars by name. To call something by name in Hebrew thought meant you had a level of authority and power over it. And so he calls the stars by name. And not only does he bring them out and call them by name, but not one of them is missing because of his great power and strength. He sustains the existence of the stars in the sky. Jacob, why do you say? And Israel, why do you assert? Now that God has declared his power over all things and his power even over the stars of the sky, he turns to ask Israel a question. Jacob, why do you say? And Israel, why do you assert? My way is hidden from the Lord. My claim is ignored by God. These two questions are really interesting in how they are pointing to two different things with the Lord. One, it's saying that God cannot see, and what is happening to the people of Israel is not seen, it's hidden. And two, not only is it hidden, but God is just straight ignoring what is going on. Well, Jacob and Israel point to the fact that this is the covenant people of God. And to say that the covenant God of Israel and Jacob is hidden, the God who created all things, is something's hidden from him, well, that's absurd. And to say that God ignores it, God doesn't ignore it. Do you not know? Have you not heard? This is directly in correlation to what was said back here as a rhetorical question. Do you not know? Have you not heard? And it points again just to the absurdity of the people of Israel making these kind of claims. Because of course they know who God is. And of course they've heard who God is. He's the covenant-keeping God, and that's exactly what's said here. The Lord is everlasting. He is not bound or limited by time and history. He is not and He was not. He is the creator of the whole earth. That means that everywhere, even in Babylon, where they're going to be exiled to, He is creator over that. He never becomes faint or weary, and there is no limit to His understanding. God is infinite in every way, and thus He, in His infinite, can even give strength to the faint and the powerless, because there is no limit to God. He is so limitless that He is able to pour out His unlimited strength and unlimited vigor and unlimited zeal to His people to give them strength, even when they feel powerless. Even the most exuberant of people, the youth may become faint and weary, young men may stumble and fall. Even the most exuberant of people will fall down in weakness at some point, because we don't have an unlimited source of energy and power, but God does. And those who trust in the Lord will renew their strength. God will give them energy and vigor, a spiritual vitality to be able to sustain anything. Paul gives us an understanding of this in 2 Corinthians. This is the section where Paul has been hit by a thorn in the flesh, which we don't know what that thorn is, but then he understands, because Jesus says to him, "My grace is sufficient for you, and my power is perfected in weakness." And Paul then responds, "Therefore, I will most gladly boast all the more about my weakness. For when I am weak, then I am strong." Because he can bear any weakness or insult or hardship or persecution and any difficulty for the sake of Christ. This is what it looks like for us to be renewed. And they will soar on the wings like eagles. If we think about eagles, we think about how they fly and they get up way into the sky and the wind carries them without them having to flap their wings at all. They just soar on the wind, which becomes their power. That's how we are to be as people, trusting in the Lord, being renewed in our strength, and soaring like eagles on the power of God. And therefore, no matter if we are running spiritually or walking spiritually, we will not weary and we will not faint. Whether it's a spiritual sprint or the plodding walk of our everyday spiritual life, our strength comes from the Lord, who provides us strength every day.
Welcome to the question and answer time. My name is Summer, I'm Pastor Charles's wife, and we're glad that you're here with us. This particular week, as I was listening, we got to the verse that it talks about the Lord naming the stars, and I thought that was so sweet, because just a couple days ago I was telling our kids that the Lord knows every star by name. And I had forgotten that it came from Isaiah. I actually thought it was a psalm. It might be in the Psalms as well, I don't know, but I thought that was really sweet, because that just came up in conversation. But this section was so good. It reminded me a lot of Job. At the end of Job, those last about 4 chapters or so, maybe 5, where God shows up and he just declares who he is. And he's so awesome that Job can't even speak anymore. Job just is like, I don't have any more words. I'm done.
Yeah. There's an interesting tie with the book of Job, like you were saying. So in that section, in verse, what does it say? And the tempest carries them off like stubble. That same word, the tempest right there, is the same word for whirlwind.
Oh.
Which is how God speaks
to Job. In the whirlwind.
So, yep.
That's interesting.
Which in our study, we went through the CSB, and I have the ESV here, and it uses the word whirlwind.
Interesting. Yeah, because I don't really remember it anywhere else in the Bible showing up whirlwind. That's really neat. This section really did remind me of Job. And it was interesting, too, because I didn't pre-read the text before the study, and when we got to the end, verse 31, where it talks about they will run and not grow weary, and they'll walk and not faint. I've heard that so much. And it was always a scripture that I felt like was directed like at us, like we will run and not grow weary, and we will not lose our strength. Being more focused on humans rather than God, but then in the whole context of God is powerful and He's awesome and He's everlasting and He's good and all these things, I'm like, wow, that points to nothing of my worth. It's like He's such a sustainer.
That He can sustain me through my weariness.
Yeah, like if I walk, if I run, if life is hard, if it's going well, like He's the one that sustains me. So in context, it is not about me. That verse is so much about the Lord and His goodness.
Especially when you see it in connection to the eagle. You know, like, they shall mount up with wings like eagles. Like the eagle, specifically when it gets up high in the drafts of the upper atmosphere, like it's able to soar for miles. Maybe not miles, but it's soar for a long time without moving its wings at all. Like it just soars because the wind carries it.
And apart from the wind, it would plummet.
Yeah.
So the wind, even a translation of the Spirit can be wind. And so like, I don't know all of what the Lord was trying to tell us in that, but even just like us resting in Him, Him sustaining us so well in the midst of, like, how do we thrive? It's Him.
Yeah, it's through allowing His Spirit to fill us like a kite. And push us along and move us along and mold us and shape us and grow us like a small tree or plant. I mean, it is His sustaining force, His power, the reason that we are able to run and not grow weary and walk and not faint. Well, those are also talking in very spiritual terms right there. That we will run and walk in a spiritual sense without being weary. I mean, and that's why I tied it in the study to Paul. Because why was Paul able to, when he was weak, he was strong. Why was he strong? Not because of Paul's physical ability, but because of the grace that was sufficient in Paul's weakness. The grace of God which was sufficient in Paul's weakness.
Yeah, and something the Lord has taught me, even just in the last week and a half, as I was talking it through with someone, is we're running this race of life. And it talks about run as if you were running for the prize. And it's a marathon. Like, you keep going and you don't stop. And to just think through, like, how do we run our race with endurance? It's looking over and remembering we're not alone. And running knowing that He's our prize. And that eternity with Him is so much more. I've heard some people talk about, like, why even waste your retirement? Like, do the work of the Lord until this race is done. Run until the very end. If the Lord gives you 60 years or 95 years, run until the end, which is just a good challenge because, our physical bodies might get tired, but He is the sustainer even of our physical bodies too.
We hope that is you today, those of you who've been watching all the way through, that the Lord would be your sustainer and that He would be the wind in your sails as you spread your wings and mount up on wings like eagles. We are so excited to be able to do this again with you next week, and we are praying for you that this verse right here, Isaiah 40 verse 31, would be true for you today.